I will, it's worth letting you know that we're going to record this just so we can archive it for folks later on if they'd like to read, or if Susan wants to revisit her greatest hits from the night, we can do so. As I mentioned, I'm Ander Monson. I'm the editor of Diagram. We are in our 20th year this year, and it's really exciting to be celebrating 20. We can vote now, which is great. It's a good time to be able to vote. So we're going to try to do that. But tonight we are here to celebrate the books of, primarily the books of Susan Neville. She has a great new book called, it's not going to show up here probably, The Town of Whispering Dolls. You can just see, there we go, you can just see the face, which is enough to give you the sense of it. That came out from FC2 last spring, I think a couple weeks after my Gnome Stories book. You can't really see that here either without me turning off my virtual background, came off. And then, you know, the pandemic blew up everything we were planning on doing, or we may have dreamed of planning on doing. So I wanted to try to do an event to celebrate Susan's work, which is I really love this book and I love her essays, and she's a writer I've never seen read. And the best way to do that is to invite her to read for your series that you just kind of started. So Susan, thank you so much for coming tonight. Our format this evening is I'm going to read for 15 minutes or so from the Gnome Stories. I'll open up for Susan, then she's going to read for 15, 20 minutes from Town of Whispering Dolls. And that'll leave us a little bit of time at the end for a Q&A. If you have questions you'd like to ask, we're happy to answer some of them. I've got a couple in particular I'd like to ask, but I'm happy to defer those to you if you would like. I'll post a couple links on the chat during her reading, because I can't really do that easily while I'm doing this and also doing the tech. So without further ado, I guess I will welcome myself. I'm not going to give myself an introduction. Although I will say, I was just, you know, on Twitter, I read like a really great review of this book that just came out. But it sort of singled out, there's one story that like everyone seems to hate or just like not like in this story. I mean, in the book, and it's like this owl story. So I was really tempted to read it, but I'm not going to read it tonight. Thanks, Rose. I love the owl story too. Like, I don't get it, but like every review of this book has been like, yeah, you know, this is a really great book, but then there's this terrible owl story that just doesn't do it. I'm like, all right, well, that's how we're doing it. I don't mean to single out him as a reviewer. I thought it was a lovely review, but I was just like, this is just bizarre. I always liked the story. And thanks to Kate Bernheimer, actually, who published it in Exo Orpheus, 50 New Myths back in the day. So Kate also, thumbs up. We both thumbs up, and Rose thumbs up to the owl story too. But anyway, I'll read a different story. I'm going to read a story that I wrote for this project called Seven Rings that my friend Nicole Walker was doing at the Huffington Post, in which she got a bunch of writers and artists to, you would get a story or a piece of art the day before, and then you would write something that day, and they would publish it the next day. And then someone else would kind of like take a cue from that piece and then write something kind of in response to that. So this is, in that's the way, it's an ekphrastic piece. And it's called Believing in the Future with the Torturer's Apprentice. And it has a special background here. So Believing in the Future with the Torturer's Apprentice. I left, but then I returned in the after of after, when the world was mostly smoke and the air was completely ruined, without telling my husband or his other wife, those other girls with his eyes and her hair that I found under the stairs. We had agreed to leave it all behind. The silver vessels, the 132 Korok trays I had collected, our wedding rings, the cat's ashes, my mother's, the stinky sinks that you could never fully clean, not with help, not ever, the hair clustered in the drains, the geologic rings of calcium around the pool, the still box Christmas lights, the speculum, the college syllabi, love letters, computers, the photographs of pain that were his life's work, women's mouths mostly frozen, opening into the acrid air. They were saying untold things, only my husband knows just what, and now they weren't saying anything. They were burning. They had probably already burned. It took almost a decade to feel that I could believe in him fully. He did, after all, have another spouse, another house, 2 kids in the photographs he hid away from me in the cubby below the stairs. We had none. He hadn't wanted another one. It didn't bother me. I said it didn't bother me. It was easier this way. I had my portion of the space. I didn't need him every day. I got my way enough. I had my work enough. My friends enough. I was coughing less and less. The lifetime of whatever it was in my lungs finally clearing up. So the press called him the torturer's apprentice. The phrase was apt, though he disliked it. You know his mentor better, the more famous artist, the one who goes without a name. He used just a pompous little glyph, which drove people crazy. But my husband, the lesser known, he has a name. He's the one who's into mouths. He prepared the girls. He did the contracts up. The glyph wouldn't do the contracts or the casting. Like a wizard, he wouldn't appear until the girls were prepped and ready, until they'd been emptied out. All the materials had to be there before he showed, and he wouldn't stay after. So my husband, the apprentice, took his photos while they were still in prep. Then the glyph did his famous thing, and then the girls went home. Sometimes they came to the gallery shows, signed autographs or editions. When they did, they looked oddly blank. They said they didn't remember anything. They looked like they were haloed in light, like they were levitating. My husband showed me the studio, an operating room totally clean and bare in chemical and steel, restraints, one-way mirrors. It's fucked up. I'm the first one to tell you it's fucked up. I've always known it is. But it is honest. Deep down, all of us are fucked. It takes a special something to bring that out so far, so fast from us. The two of them may be reviled, but no one looks away. In our world, no one ever looks away. So the secret with my husband's photographs is that you can't fully tell what they're about. Orgasm or agony, groan or moan or first speech or hum, if there is a difference. Either way, it's something emerging, not yet fully formed, a breath between breaths, an aperture opening, and a way to punctuate a day, a night, a life. The close-up of the mouth is where it's at for him, the folded V of tongue, the lemniscate of lips closed and opening. A mouth is like a flower, he said. A mouth is like a bird. A mouth is like a tease, a feet with toes unfurling. A mouth is like a fountain. I said, no, a mouth is like a hive of bees, slow cave-in, being hanged, a bomb. You can't deny it moves you, he said. You can tell it does something to you. The time elapsed between the photographs is short. The time between his publication of the photographs and the girls' release was short. Their skirts were short. It was always skirts. It was always girls. This world. It's a little sick. That's what makes it good, he said. They signed up for it. They confessed. They opened up. They released their secrets and were released. And that's the trick to it, that it's not just release of voice. It's not fake or forced. It was their choice. Everyone has them, choices, secrets, voice boxes, constraints, restraints. If pressed hard enough, we will all become swans. The torture is not the point. The point is the joint between the time before and the time after, the crux, that photograph, not representing time, but time itself, that crossing space. This used to be the world. Now this is the world. Sometimes the worlds, they seem the same. You can barely tell the difference. Clouds before, clouds hereafter, but something's changed. You can feel it. If you look close enough, the seam, the way we work out memories, what gets stored, distarred for later easy retrieval, what gets discarded, boarded up, how a moment, an accident, a gas explosion, a runaway train spreading sudden fire, a dozing driver on the interstate, fragment of falling satellite, an affair, a series of affairs, hair loss, a decapitation from a sheet of glass like in The Omen, power surge at the wrong time, power line drooping in the pool, anaphylactic shock, lightning strike, bandsaw slip, not to mention rapture, heart attack, stroke, or other ways the body can up and fail us. These are abysses with no bottom. Narrative works like this. Our lives work like this. Our lives are not narrative except as synapse makes them so. If he needed to photograph it, which he did, needing to document it, I accepted that. He had nodded off in an either haze in the medieval-themed Best Western, formerly the Sybaris, where we used to meet in the early days of our affair. Now it's under new management, but it still takes cash and asks no questions. So I clicked on his camera. There were 66 shots of the fireball going up, our house bursting with gas, all of our stuff being converted to flame, and one close-up of a mouth. My mouth. Was I laughing? I wasn't sure. He didn't need to know I would go back. We agreed there would be no going back. It made sense. We left the cars, otherwise they would know. Ditto with the clothes, the photographs, the pornographic DVDs that we hadn't watched for years. The two irreplaceable pieces of his mentor's work. Anything that meant anything had to stay, to burn. Needless to say, there could be no note or explanation. So since he didn't need to know, I took the rental car back. It was dark, but I knew the route. I wore a wig. I wore a skirt. In my old life, I never wore a skirt. Was I an object or a subject in the skirt? As I watched from down the block, I could see my mouth, an apparition in the daylight side of the rear view, and surprised, I closed it. I disappeared. Ours was not the first to burn. For the last week, townhouses in the hills around had been going up like far-off Christmas lights. It was festive. I'd have a drink each time. Plumes of gas erupted through roofs, followed by the slow wind of sirens up the curling streets. I couldn't sleep, so I would watch them go. Sometimes I would take the car to get a closer look. Faulty gas lines got blamed. Weak hearts got blamed. Electrical fires got blamed. Houses not up to code. Arson, maybe, the police started to think. Just bad luck, said others. A psychic said, consult your ghosts, but no one knew what to do with that. The more houses that disappeared, the more I started to think about disappearing myself. I didn't know where that feeling came from, but what I knew is that I wanted me gone, us gone, the whole record of us and who we had decided to be gone. We too could be swans, I said. We could come out of this something else. It was a calculated risk. It's not as if I wasn't willing to share him. To be sure, I didn't want him more than occasionally. His other wife, that family, I knew almost nothing about. He wanted it that way. I didn't even know their names. I didn't want to know their names. He said that way it would be pure, prudent, unputrefiable. He knew how women were, he said. He knew how knowing could weigh you down. It took him 10 years to give up his secrets. For us to have a future we could finally believe in together, for us to have no space between us, for us to have all access passes. And that's why he loves me now, because I can know and hear him, I can know and hold his secrets suspended in my body and not hate him for them, because I understood, because I said I understood. When I knew them all, that knowing was really something. And that's why I really stayed, that sense of ownership, of openness. We were a pane of glass. I couldn't stand the opaque house, his second house, the constant smell of gas, the unbroken winter sunlight, the flimsy walls that could barely keep the howls of neighbors' dogs outside and our sex lives in. The whole neighborhood, Lakewood Grove, had no lakes, no wood, no groves. The whole place was a fiction, a city without city things like a government or police force. It had no past. We had no past. We were pressed flat. We were drying paper. Without a past, what were we? A moment in a photograph? I didn't miss the house then, and I don't miss it now. And now the house is gone, and so are we, except in memory. We're someone else, I think. Even so, when I went back without his knowledge, I took just one thing, a picture of the ash. What else he doesn't know is this. I take my own photographs when he's asleep. I pet his throat. I subtly pluck his eyebrows. I tease his lips apart. I pry his eyelids slowly open like a clam. I touch the eye. I roll it in its orbit. Sometimes I spit on it. I interrogate it. I put small objects in his mouth, make him swallow and wonder later. He can't tell. He'll never tell or know. He takes these sleeping pills because of restlessness. I can do whatever to his mouth when he is out. The drugs make him suggestible. This is my mouth, I whisper, breathing onion on him. I exfoliate his skin. I peel his lips. I watch his muscles move involuntarily. I stroke his teeth. I depress the tongue. This has been going on a year. When will it be enough, I wonder? It's not art, I said. It's something else. And thanks. That's the end of that story. Kind of creepy, actually. There's a lot of really creepy stories in this book that I like actually quite a bit about. It's one of the things I like about my own book, apparently. So I'm going to segue over here. That's not the right one. Oh, there we go. That's fine. I made these earlier, so I might as well share one of them here. In Arizona, we don't really have leaves. And so the leaves that you see in front of you are the fall themed Trader Joe's chips that come in 4 different colors that I decided I would use to make a sort of like fall tableau of owls. So we're going to segue here to Susan Neville, whose book I have with me and whose book I love. It's really a great book. I discovered her work a long time ago when one of my students was really excited about Susan Neville. I think she must have been one of your students at Butler, I assume, Allie Leach. And she was like so pumped up about this book, Fabrications. And she's like, you got to read Fabrications. And I'm like, all right. If someone's that pumped up about something, I get really excited about it. And so I'm like happy to kind of follow that up. And I read Fabrications and I loved it. It was a really great book in which she's sort of going to do tours of how things are made in America. And there's 2 essays in particular that I really loved out of that book. One was going to the casket factory and one was going to the place where the dolls are made. And it's a brilliant book. It's great. Love the essay. And so I contacted Susan a little while later because I'm kind of obsessed with this doll essay of hers. And partially because I've been getting into dolls myself a little bit, in the last few years. And then we had a conversation about it that I'll post a link to it on Essay Daily about some of the decisions she made in the essay, and that you should really go check it out if you have the chance. It's one of my favorite essays to read and reread, and it keeps giving a lot to it. And when we're having that conversation, she was also, she's like, well, I'm working on this book, a whole book about dolls. I'm like, oh, hell yeah. And it's a really great book about dolls and dolls in very different angles. I published a couple of them in Diagram, and I'll put a couple links to them in the chat while she's reading also. And she's one of my favorite essayists and one of my favorite short story writers. And you should really pick up the book if you haven't already. It will reward your attentions. So without further ado, I'm going to swap over to Susan Neville. Welcome. And you look like you may be muted, Susan.
I'm now unmuted. I had to figure it out, and I don't have any background. I feel bad. Who kind of introduced us. I will always remember Allie because of an introduction she did for Victor Lavelle at Butler. She wrote a song and did a tap dance on top of a table. She was like one of the most energetic people I think I've ever known. And wonderful, wonderful human being. This book, The Town of Whispering Dolls, actually came out of the factory book in some ways. I've been writing nonfiction for a couple of years, and I wanted to start writing stories again. And so some of the stories I just started thinking, okay, there are all these places I'd been to a doll factory, I'd been to a steel mill. They would all be great settings if I, imagined characters in them. So I started, doing some things with that, and then it went off in different directions. I want to say, because it's just a few more weeks till the election, that This is, I live in Indiana. I've lived in Indiana all my life. I started this book, The Town of Whispering Dolls, when unfortunately Mike Pence was governor. He was a really bad governor. He would have probably not been reelected as governor had he not been chosen as a vice presidential candidate. So, but at the time he was governor, one of the small towns in Indiana had was like the epicenter of new HIV cases in the United States. And the reason for that in part was because of the drug policies of the state of Indiana. People were not allowed to do needle exchanges. I'm not usually a political writer, but I have to say this is in some ways a political book. And so most of the doll stories have to do with the opioid epidemic in small towns in Indiana. The towns were kind of waiting for things to be the way they were in the 1950s. The factories have gone. The stories are primarily often from the point of view of grandmothers whose children are addicted. And let's see what else. Oh, there's one other, since I'm talking about Mike Pence, and I'm not going to read this story, but one of the things that also happened during that time is that the Pence family had a large gasoline facility in southern Indiana. It was called Keel Brothers. There was an article about this in the Chicago Tribune, and left a large amount of pollution, ground pollution, that then seeped into the ground and became a Superfund site called the Garden City toxic plume. And that plume is still there. And one of the stories is about the plume. But I'm not going to read that. I'm going to read one of the dolls stories, since this is a night of dolls and gnomes. And I don't know quite how to do this. This is so strange. But this is a story called Resurrection. And these dolls, most of the dolls in the stories are kind of half human, half not. And they walk and they move down the street. These dolls are more like Playmobil dolls, and kids are playing with them. So when the leaves turned yellow and the cold October rains began, children in the elementary school were given egg babies to care for. They spent recess making cribs out of shoe boxes, and some of the children made cunning little onesies out of cloth cut from the legs and arms of old clothes purchased from the 5-cent box at yard sales. Those who were interested in design, and there were several, put shoe boxes together to make a sort of house, often with backyards and playground equipment made from spoons and straws smuggled in from the lunchroom. The most elaborate of these were displayed on the craft table to show the grandparents who showed up on Parents' Day. Some of the children wrapped construction paper around the shoeboxes and drew on windows and doors and made dividers for the inside of the box. When the teacher said the box was supposed to be a crib, these children scoffed because the box was way too big for one baby, and besides, the baby would never grow any larger. They made a smaller space inside one corner of the box for the baby, and picked grass and then crunched leaves for the baby to sleep on. Then they made paper dolls or brought in little plastic or rag people the size of grown-ups' thumbs, usually toys from fast food meals or discards from larger sets of Army men or Playmobil or Fisher-Price. They put the little people in the boxes with the babies, and said they were the mothers or fathers or brothers or sisters or cousins. There were no boyfriends or girlfriends or step anything, because the children decided that adults would only be known by their blood relation to the babies. During the day, the children would take the little people out of the box, leaving the babies alone in their mangers. They made the little people hop from desk to desk, looking for something to do, while the children were supposedly filling out worksheets, preparing for their futures. Sometimes a child would sneak a mother or a sister inside a desk with a plastic soldier or a miniature man, and they'd do what older people do in the dark. The man would leave after and maybe go into another desk, and the mother or sister he left behind would come out with a dusty penny or piece of hard candy, and then go back into the box with the baby and fall into a sleep so hard you had to shake them to wake them back up. It could have been a girl soldier with a father or brother, of course, but that's not a scenario any of the children had seen. Usually the fathers and brothers died in cars or basements or wars, and the mothers and sisters were left with the babies, though lately a lot of them had been dying too. Everyone, it seemed, waited for the grandparents and great-grandparents, who at least a few of them could sometimes be counted on, if only to grieve. The children were supposed to take the babies home with them each night. They had to walk home with the babies without dropping them on the street. Some of the babies didn't make it, and a child had to watch its baby's skull crack, the yellow brains ooze out. It was not a contest, but the children felt the one who kept its baby safe the longest would win nonetheless. One child lost so many babies at night and even during the day at recess that his desk was covered with death and birth certificates. Because of course you couldn't have one child doing nothing in a classroom while the other children were caring for their babies. So the child's baby was given a funeral and a certificate of dying before being composted, and then the child was given a new one. Clumsy child, though. The new baby was usually gone before the day was out and a replacement brought from the refrigerator. I'm going to stop here for a second and just say that when my son was in school, their class had to do these egg babies, and he was the one who kept breaking them all day long. But anyway, the compost heap was in the back of the playground near the wildflower garden, right next to the exhibit of native prairie grass. In early fall, explosions of stinging yellow jackets flew out of the ground by the compost, and the children adopted a zigzag pattern of running to get away from them. The teacher kept an EpiPen in her pocket, cocked and loaded, because she didn't want to move the graveyard away from the gardens. She'd read on Facebook that both compost and bees were good for flowers, and she was a young enough teacher that she hoped to save the world. She added table scraps from the lunchroom and coffee grounds from the teacher's break room, and along with the dead babies, she was making some rich loam where before there had been nothing. Little wasps. Now fall was here, and the workers were all dying off, leaving one fat, satisfied queen, and these babies raising their own fragile babies, and so on. The babies had been the teacher's idea from the beginning. She learned it at college, so it wasn't an original idea in the larger world, just one new to this community. It had started years ago as a way to remind children when the hormones started in a few years what it meant to care for a baby. It's fragile. You can't get rid of it. Of course, none of them remember that lesson any more than they remember their multiplication tables. She knew this because she'd been in school with some of their parents, and now here they were, the offspring. The fragile shells in the shoeboxes were porcelain and brown and spotted, and some of them shades of aqua, but inside all of them was the same goo. Perhaps that was the real lesson. Wouldn't it be easier if we boiled them? One of the children always asked her, as though he'd been the first one to ever think of it. You could, she told the child, but then the baby would be dead, wouldn't it? Oh yes, the children said, but we'd be off the hook. We could throw them to each other on the playground, have them sit next to us on the buses without worrying that if they fell on the floor and rolled away, they'd die. They might crack, of course, but inside they'd be all soft and sweet, like a puffball, ready to be born. Not entirely, the teacher said. The smell of rot would not be pleasant. I would eat mine before it rotted, one of the children always said, and then the ones with active imaginations would turn to the child who said that and hiss, "Cannibal." One of the children said she realized you couldn't put the goo back inside when it came out, but she wanted to start a hospital for the slightly injured, and the teacher said, sure, why not? They decided to put the hospital underneath the stage in the cafetorium. The child who ran the hospital had a mother who was a licensed practical nurse, so she had been around hospitals. She chose as her assistant a boy whose older brother had left the house in an ambulance, his body covered by canvas, even his face. So the boy knew about emergency vehicles. It was his job to run sick or cracked babies down to the cafetorium in the watch box that the teacher's Christmas present watch had come in. When a baby's child thought she'd heard her baby crying like she was sick or hurt, but didn't have any outward signs of cracks or pain, the doctor who ran the hospital would simply keep it for a day or two in a dark place and let the child come in to rock it at recess. The doctor knew that sometimes it was the child that needed the quiet, dark space for just a while, and not necessarily the baby who was ill. The doctor would get the child to talk about what was wrong with the baby, and sometimes the stories of what the little people had done to the baby were so horrific that the doctor would think of closing down the hospital so she wouldn't have to hear the stories anymore. She was such a good doctor that sometimes a child would bring a little person who had stopped moving. The doctor would nod her head gravely and say she was afraid there was nothing she could do. They would cry together then, and when the child was done crying, he would go back to the classroom where another child would help him write an obituary. The teacher was pleased at how the children worked together and all the life skills they were learning. Once or twice, the doctor herself or her assistant would accidentally drop a baby, and the teacher would sneak a replacement down to the hospital, and the baby's child would usually never know the difference. There was, in fact, only one hyper-observant child who had held her baby up to the light once and was able to identify the tiniest bit of gray transparency in one spot on the baby and so wasn't fooled. All of this went on through October. The first week in November, the skies turned the leaden gray. They would remain until April. And the little people in the boxes went into a kind of funk. More and more when he left, so there would be some consistency in the child's life when he returned. But when the owner was away, no one was taking care of the shoebox, and it became a place with an unsavory reputation. The children told their teacher about it, and she asked the principal if a social worker might be persuaded to come to her classroom. But he reminded her that there were only two in the entire county, and their plates were full. The only child temperamentally suited to take on a social worker's role was the doctor. As was usually the case, the children did without one. So the little people kept going into the abandoned shoebox, and some of them stumbled back to their own shoebox, and some were covered with canvas and sent by watch box down to the hospital. When they didn't return, no one knows what happened to them except for the doctor and perhaps the teacher. They were too toxic to put in the compost to make playground equipment. It was rumored that the rest were thrown in the trash. No matter. The doctor's main concern was the babies, of course, keeping them alive. But some of the babies seemed to be showing signs of abrasions, and if you looked at them long, the baby's child said, you could see them jerk like they were having seizures. And inside, their poor little hearts were beating irregularly. And you can sometimes see the heartbeat through the fragile skin. By the end of the first week in November, the doctor was overwhelmed and sad. She had permission to stay late after school, and she sat underneath the stage listening to the AYS kids doing their homework and eating their snacks. It was all a distant sound, and it sounded a little bit like a natal unit this week, lying there so still. She took the vital signs of each one, and there were, as far as she could tell, no vital signs, or very faint ones. What would she tell her classmates? Her teacher couldn't keep supplying babies. Soon it would be the holidays and she would have other things to think about. And what purpose did it serve to keep replacing them? They would grow up to be the little people who hopped from desk to desk or spent the day sprawled out on the floor of the absent boy's shoebox. The doctor's mother had sent her to school that day with a safety pin holding up the hem of the pants she was wearing. Her mother, the LPN, was not doing particularly well, and the doctor was feeling a kind of despair she wasn't used to feeling. Most days she woke up feeling that she was a real doctor, and she believed, despite everything, that someday she would be one, or a teacher, like her teacher. But some days, like today, she didn't know how she could make that happen. She looked around her at the babies lying in the soft flannel nest she'd made from one of her mother's old nightgowns. She could still smell her mother's scent on those nightgowns. Maybe she was meant for something different in this life, or maybe she wasn't meant for anything at all. It was in this mood that she took the safety pin from her hem and picked up one of the babies. She placed some tape over the places she would pierce, and then she carefully passed the pin into the skull of the baby and then into the baby's bottom. She put the baby's fontanelle into her mouth and she blew everything the baby had inside it, every last bit of potential, into a bowl. She did it with all 10 of them and took the bowl of goo back to the compost heap and said a prayer. She was careful to wash the babies after that, and she put them for a few seconds into the microwave in the teacher's lounge to kill any lingering bacteria. And then she brought them back and the teacher let her go down to the cafetorium with some poster paints and glitter. The doctor had some of her mother's clear nail polish in the pocket of her white lab coat, an old shirt that had belonged to her mother. It took her about an hour to paint each one of the babies, each a glorious rich gem or Easter color with dots of glitter and glue. She covered them with nail polish to make them stronger. They were empty inside, but they were so very beautiful now. She carried them back to the classroom and distributed the marvels to their parents. See how light they are. Don't cry, she told them. Their spirits have gone to heaven with the others. They're angels now, and nothing will hurt them, she lied. They're watching over you and loving you, she lied. What you're holding is just the beautiful reminder of where the life used to be. There's no more suffering for them, so please don't cry. See how they sparkle? Even if you crush them, they'll be beautiful. That's it. That's that story. of, it's called, what's it even called? It's resurrection. It's the babies being resurrected without any souls.
That was awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, well done. As you know, I love that story, and it read really well too.
Thanks. It's the first time I've ever read that story. Actually, because our books both came out during COVID, we've probably not really read.
No, I hadn't read that story. I've read a couple other pieces of other stories, but never that one, all for the same reason.
Yeah, it's been a strange year.
It has. So I've got a couple questions I actually would like to ask. If anyone else wants to ask questions, you're welcome to in the chat, or we can, just like, you could raise your hand. I'm not sure how the hand thing works. I know theoretically we can do that, but I sort of like the chat idea better. And you could have got at this a little bit when you sort of pause the story to talk a little bit about like where it came from, like autobiographically. And I was spent some time with reading The Dead, the story in the book, in part. And I wondered, there's like a line, well, there's a couple things I wondered about it. So my first question is, it felt very familiar to me. Like I had a colleague who just died also. And I teach at a university, and it felt like very real in a way that certainly felt autobiographical. It had that heat to it, whether or not it is invented or autobiographical. It felt clearly so. And there's a couple moments in that story too, where you move, you do these like really non-fictional moves. There's a moment where like, the eye of the story like goes to like research the history of Brinkley's. And so there's this weird like research lab. I don't know if Brinkley's is a real place.
Yeah, it is.
So it feels like it. And so there's like this riff on that. And then it kind of goes back to story mode, and then goes back to this like listing of all the weird medicines that may have been in Brinkley's. And I love like the way in which like, that's like such an essay move for me. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about like how the nonfiction and the fiction collide in your work or feed off of each other.
Thanks for asking that and for calling out the essay that's stuck in the middle of this book of short stories. I mean, I made changes in that. I fictionalized things, but you do that when you're writing essays too. And the only reason I included it is because who knows when you'll have another book, and I wanted to do it in, memory of this person. But also, I should have put it at the end. After you write a book, you think of all the things you should have done. It should have been at the end, because I was thinking of, like doing a place, and I wanted, something at the end, like, and, obviously there are all these references to Joyce's The Dead in the story, and that was purposeful. But the reason I talked myself into thinking that I could include it is because, this is my thinking, the book was really about addiction and about drugs, and this is really convoluted, but they are sitting around, they're, academics in a former drugstore talking about the history of drugs, and this is a very different kind of group of people from the people in the stories, in the other stories, which are, primarily like out in the kind of dark places in the state. And so, and also, a lot of the addictions started because of drugs that were prescribed. And Eli Lilly is a big, major part of the economy in Indianapolis. And so it was the drugs, and thinking about the contrast between, what was going on outside in the country. And I'm within the old drugstore and the history of drugs and pharmacies and things like that. So I convinced myself that it would work. And it's really interesting because of the reviews. People mention that story a lot. It's like you said, people don't like your owl story. I love your owl story. Read the owl story. But it's like, yeah, it's like people either say, no, I really like, these longer stories that have this kind of, that are less fable-like, I guess, or less odd, less magical, realist, whatever. Or they say that no, it doesn't really work, doesn't fit. So yeah. But your real question was how you combine those moves. When I first started writing, I was thinking about this today because there wasn't really a word. The word creative nonfiction wasn't a thing. I wrote essays, and I would send my essays to magazines, and the magazines would say, we don't publish essays, but we'll publish this if you call it a story. It's like, okay. And then when essays became very popular, I would send things, and they'd say, oh, we would publish this if you'll call it an essay. So, I mean, from the very beginning, I think the moves are the same. A lot of the stories I write are first person, and a first person short story is, to me, an essay written by a fictional character. So, you make the same moves. You can do research. You can have the character looking down and Googling something. There's a story in the book called Beheadings where one of the characters is just like the character in The Dead, is constantly looking down in her lap and Googling the history of beheadings and bringing that up in the conversations. So I do use a lot of the same movements, I guess, in nonfiction and fiction. And also, when I first started, I would say that the very first book I had published had an essay in it. It was a short story collection called The Invention of Flight, and the essay Cousins is in there. And I sent it out every place as an essay, and nobody would take it because it was an essay nobody did essays with. And then Indiana Winter, that book is completely just a mixture of essays and short stories, which now I guess you would say is a hybrid. But at the time I had to say, okay, got to, say this one is an essay because I stand by this I as me. These aren't, this I is somebody else. It had very little to do with had very little to do with whether actual details were true and more to do with whether the persona felt honestly me.
That's great. So we got a couple of questions that popped up in the chat, and they're kind of related, which is one person, Ambrosia, asked where, like, she wants to know, like, what our doll collections are like. It's not really about the books. I don't know if you have a doll collection. I don't have a doll collection.
I don't have a doll collection.
You don't have one at all?
No.
No. I don't have one either. And sort of, I mean, I do. Well, I have a Spice Girls doll collection. So I have like a number of Spice Girls dolls, and I'll briefly turn off my background here to show you can see some of, there we go. Here's some of, I have a doll head collection. I really like doll heads. And I have her down here. She used to be in my office. And since it's, we're now down in the pandemic. And my daughter asked me this too, because this was just like, I don't know, a year ago, because I have a lot of doll parts. I have doll hands and heads that I've, for a long time, and I'll just tell briefly a story about this. Like, so I used to teach this workshop, and I wanted to find a way to incentivize students to kind of grade each other. or like reward each other for having like making like a really good comment in workshop or something like that. So we gave everyone like a bag of doll heads and parts at the beginning of the semester. And they,
Why would you do that?
um, well, why not? It's
I
just,
know, I know, I just.
I mean, I love the idea of them carrying around this like bag of doll parts. And then like when someone made a really great comment or something like that, they would give them a part, and whoever had the most parts at the end of the semester automatically got an A. But I mean, I like them kind of carrying them around. And then I sort of started using them for like my thesis students. Like they get a doll head when they successfully defend an MFA thesis, or if I'm on their committee, they'll get a doll arm or something like that. So
Oh,
and
that's
I've
interesting.
embraced a kind of weird like eccentricity with regard to it.
So why are you fascinated by dolls?
I'm not sure. Like, I mean, if I were if I knew I wouldn't be able, I probably wouldn't be fascinated by them. Like I feel that's just kind of how obsession works. And I've been writing about them.
Yeah,
Like I didn't use dolls much in fiction, but I've been, I mean, although there's like, there's like a golem that shows up
right. I was thinking that.
in the Gnome Stories, which is pretty
And the
close
gnome is a kind of
in the
doll
Gnome.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't have a doll collection, but Andrew knows this. One of my essays I wrote after going to a doll factory, and you should go there because it's got boxes of doll legs and doll arms, and and the thing that was so weird to me about the doll factory, and it was like an essay that wrote itself, was that the person who made the doll heads, which are kind of plastic, soft rubber or whatever, would pour the flesh into this thing that would then swirl around and the flesh would coat the inside of it. And he'd take the top like that, and then he'd take I don't know, thing like this, and he'd stab the top, and then that way he could bring the doll out of the metal, form, the doll head, and then he'd blow it up like by putting air in it, and that would make the eyes bulge out, and he'd put the eyes in and things like that. So to me, it was like just a really interesting way of thinking about dolls and about abortion in particular. Um, but I don't know. I always loved dolls. When I was a kid, that was every Christmas. That was the one gift I wanted, was a doll. I can remember each of them. I always knew the name of the doll right when it came out of the box. I knew, oh, you're June. Hello. And so I never had that, except when I see one, like the ones in the background, or the ones without eyes. Then I see the uncanniness of them, the way they're human but not quite human. But for the most part, they really seemed quite live to me. Absolutely. I'd run home from school to take care of them.
There's something that I'm really interested kind of in that space also. And this was kind of a question from Megan Galbraith, who I just wanted to mention has a book coming out called The Guild of the Infant Savior, in which she
Great
is doing a
title.
number of things, but she's like also trying to like restage moments of her childhood, of her life with dolls, which I'm just very compelled by that kind of project. But there's what I've got obsessed with is like, I don't find them freaky at all. I find them kind of like beautiful and haunting and strange. But I love like trolling eBay lots of dolls. And
Mm-hmm.
I wonder with them, like, I mean, mostly just people selling doll parts to other people that need parts to build dolls. But for me, like when I see them, I'm like, how can I not see the weird, disturbing effect that, like, there are hundreds of doll torsos or whatever,
Oh yeah.
and they seem not to at all. Or if they do, they just don't acknowledge it.
And the people who make babies, I mean, I have a character in one of the stories who makes the live babies that are so live that you can't tell if it's a baby or not, which is even close to creepier because it's so close to being real. I don't know. It's an odd fascination. That my problem, like with the book cover, was to say, okay, I don't want it to look too creepy, because there's a sweetness to them, that I wanted to get across. But I also think, let's see, why I chose dolls is kind of the way of getting, well, the people in some of the stories are really not quite human because of what the drugs have done to them. And the kind of ways in which they deal with the world is it's like something has been blown out of the inside that they have to get back. But yeah,
there's like that moment also that like in which like the characters sort of blowing out the inside of the egg in here, which really reminded me of the moment in The Woman Who Sculpts the Doll, Gretel Erich Turner, where like all of a sudden like the spiking of you get these really grotesque images that are grotesque and are like very disturbing and presented as such, but then are not, like, the essay is in no way a disturbing essay or about that. It's mostly a very sweet essay. And most of these, there is a sweetness, as Kate Bernheimer points out, that makes these stories read. It'd be easy to write freaky doll story, right? I mean, that's the default mode, but that's not your default mode. And that's what's so interesting about them.
Well, the thing about, that is interesting. I hadn't thought about the thing, the knife going into the heads of the babies in two different pieces, but it's because the fontanelle is like so fragile. It's like this tiny skin space that protects a person's brain and personality and soul from extinction, and so that just always kind of creeped me out. With the dolls, like the very first newspaper article I read about the opioid use in Austin, Indiana, which is the town that had, was the epicenter for HIV and had just so many people dying every day from overdoses. It's kind of near an army base, and I just immediately, and some old man who had lived in the town for a long time said how weird it was to look out his window and see young women like that he had known when they were in grade school now walking down the street and leaning into cars, to trade sex for money. And suddenly, just in that very image, I pictured them as very emaciated dolls. And the whole book just kind of came from that image. And if it hadn't been, I guess, picturing them as dolls, and I guess the fact that I love dolls, I probably, would have been a more, I don't know, darker. Well, it's a dark book, but
it is a dark book.
Yeah,
and it's a dark book in spite of its sweetness.
It's a very dark book.
Yeah. You guys have other questions? I've got one more I'm happy to end on, but if other folks have things you'd like us to talk about before we do that, that's fine too. I'll give you a minute and then I'll ask my question. All right, short minute. You asked the question yourself in The Dead, which is how do you end a story properly? And you also kind of mentioned the end of that in the acknowledgements, that you got the idea for the ending from one of your grad students. And I couldn't find, I Googled her to see if I could find like her essay. And I guess it's maybe not published or else I'm a bad Googler.
No, it's not.
But I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit about how you found the ending of that story, which is a good ending. And one that like, I was like waiting for, that reference to finally show up. Right. I mean, there's so many other literary things happening in The Dead, but there's one.
Oh, The Dead. I thought you were talking about the story I just read. I can't even remember the end of The Dead. It's the snow.
Yeah, right. the reference to the Joyce. And I just thought, especially since that is like, an outlier of a piece in the book.
Right.
I just wondered how you would talk a little bit about ending stories.
Well, I mean, when my student was thinking about it, it was because endings were a thing that she always worried about, trying to get right. And so I thought, well, that's really interesting. Endings just seem natural. You can tell when somebody is going to be ending a story. And sometimes it's because there are like natural symbols, like it's now turning autumn, like in that story I just read, it's October, then November, and then, kind of, or a door closes, or, something kind of signals the ending, or something happens musically in the language, or you suddenly, it's that turn. I mean, that's the thing that essays and stories and poems have in common, is that kind of volta, when you just feel like, okay, it's going this way, it's going this way. I know it's going to go that way. And then it surprises you and completely makes that turn, which in the story I just read, I mean, that, kind of thinking about, the Easter eggs by Russian Orthodox Easter eggs that are, blown out and made beautiful. And that just seemed like a good turn to me. It just kind of came naturally. The Dead, I was waiting for the snow all the way. Didn't have it in my head before it started, but there was no really other way to end it. It had to be snowing all over Indiana.
Great.
What about you when you do endings? Do you have like a theory of endings, or?
Well, I've been told, and this is probably accurate, that I sometimes I sort of think of it, as like the dismount, which is how I talk about it in poetry. But I like to dismount a lot, apparently. And it's not, I don't know, it's trying to find where some like current from the story suggests like a turn underneath, right? That like, it's not when the plot is over, it's when like the real subject has moved somewhat, like the current has slightly moved and we get to move along with it at the end. And there's one story that, the one that I read kind of, it's like a dramatic monologue. So it's like, we kind of go through this character's possibly disturbed world and sort of voice, and it kind of like exhausts itself and kind of peaks and drops off. But there's another one in here, the Gollum one in particular. Like, I published it with a very different ending than I had in this version. And that's just such it's a dark fucking story. And I love like the ending that I found for it, which is just like, things get a lot worse. Like, it starts bad and then it gets a lot worse. Which is kind of what happens in a lot of the stories, actually.
You think of that like consciously, like, okay, now it's bad and I need to make it worse, or that's just the way you view?
Well, they don't all work that way, but that one in particular, like, that's like a story in which I feel like I don't have as much empathy for the character as I do in like the Reassurances or something like that, where this guy means well. He's just kind of crazy. But in that one, like, both characters like have their faults. Their marriage is a problem. Things go bad, and then they go supernaturally bad.
Yeah.
And that was like the leap that I found, is like, oh, okay, I can actually, it doesn't need to like remain like a realistic story. Like, it was a realistic story about like about like a marriage issue, or like, like an intimacy problem between these two people. And for a long time, I thought I was a realistic writer. And then I realized eventually, like, I'm not a realistic writer. And I don't need to. I can have like a Gollum show up and then like do some stuff. And I was like, oh, sweet. Like, that actually gave me like a sense of real freedom. And then, so then that one just like, it kind of like zooms out. And you're like, all right, well, but I don't try to leave people in a place of like desolation.
Yeah.
necessarily. I mean, I think they're pleasurable, mostly the places at the end. It's kind of pleasurable seeing what happens to those characters who are not particularly likable in the end of it. It has a little bit of a fairy tale quality, like someone gets punished at the end, kind of.
I always like find in essays and stories that as I get toward the end, I think it's about something, but or the narrator.
Mm-hmm.
You know, whether it's the essay narrator or the fictional narrator, has to finally say, no, 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 no. This is it. This is the thing. This
Mm-hmm.
is the hard thing. There is no resurrection. You know, I think that's kind of if I have any kind of way of ending things, it often is that, because I don't know what the hard thing is that the character or narrator is going to find, and when the character finds that, I'm like, oh God, that scares me. But
That's great. And that's a good, I think that's a good place for us to end this. That's how you also end a reading, is my crafty maneuver. So thank you so much
very good.
for coming.
Never.
And thank you all for being here and being part of this. We will archive it and make it available. I know a lot of folks couldn't make it in because of our tech problem, but so we'll try to make it available to them if they want to come and join us. But thanks, go buy Susan's book. It's a wonderful book. And I hope that you read it and enjoy it and review it, because you should.
Thank you. And Andrew's book too.
Mine too. And feel free to say something nice if you review it about the owl story. Like,
yeah, no, it's like, it's funny. Oh well.
All right, take care.
Thank you, people, for showing up.
Cheers.
See ya.
And thanks, Susan.
Oh, thank you, Ander. Appreciate it.